The God of War games have some banger intros. I don't think I've ever played through another franchise of games where the openings blew me away almost every time. So I figured I'd show some appreciation for this awesome series by ranking all of its intros from worst to best. Now, to be clear, when I say intro, I'm not just referring to the opening cutscenes. I'm talking about the first 30 minutes to an hour of gameplay, depending on which game it is. And the criteria for the ranking will be broken into story, gameplay, and the opening boss or bosses. However, the criteria will mostly just act as guidelines, rather than being a strict method of judging them. This is easily the most subjective list I've made on my channel so far, since at the end of the day, I'm basically just ranking them by how much hype they get out of me, and how excited they get me to play the rest of the game, since that's what a good intro should do. And lastly, just remember that I think they're all good. I think each of them do a great job of kicking off their respective games, and of course, with such a subjective topic, I'm not claiming in any way that my list is the correct order. Now, with some mild spoilers ahead, let's begin. Number 8, God of War Chains of Olympus. Coming from the first of the two PSP titles in the series, I think the intro in Chains of Olympus succeeds at letting the player know that the portable God of War games are fully capable of creating dynamic situations and cool set pieces. The setting of the battle is great, and the danger of the raging basilisk is always present as you continue to see it destroying the city. There are just a lot of fun moments in here, like when you get jump scared by the initial basilisk fight, or using the giant crossbows to defend the city. They also surprisingly manage to put two boss fights in this intro, being the Basilisk and the Persian King. While the fight against the King isn't too special, it's still pretty decent as a warm-up bout, and it's super satisfying to beat the shit out of him with his own gold. When it comes to the Basilisk, I think the initial fight with it is just okay, but the final phase at the end is actually pretty solid and enjoyable. It's nothing crazy, but it does create a pretty fun spectacle. Overall, there isn't much to criticize here. This intro provides plenty of action and also comes with a few light puzzles. You even get a free candle making lesson. How wholesome. But the main reason this intro is at the bottom is because while it is perfectly serviceable, there just isn't anything that sets it apart from all the other ones. Plus, this is the only intro in the series that's completely disconnected from the story of its respective game. Usually you start these games by fighting something relevant to the plot, but here it's just the Persian Empire. And that's fine, but it doesn't really have anything connecting itself to the rest of the game aside from the very end, which also kinda comes out of nowhere. So while I don't have anything against this opening sequence, there's just nothing about it that can justify a higher placement. Number 7, God of War Ghost of Sparta. The main reason this one is higher than Chains of Olympus is because out of the 3 side prequel games, this intro is easily the best story-wise. This is one of the few times in the series that we get to start things off with Kratos actually going on a mission of his own choosing, and that makes it feel a lot more meaningful. There's a lot of genuine personal stakes here, and we actually learn some pretty important information that perfectly sets up the conflict for the rest of the game. And when it comes to gameplay, the initial section on the ship is pretty cool for the whole 6 minutes that it lasts, and everything after that is generally solid enough. However, I actually do have a few gripes with this intro. First and foremost, I think the Scylla is easily the worst opening spectacle boss in the series. This thing is such a joke. The first section where you fight it is insanely bland, and afterward it only comes back in the form of occasional QuickTime events until you eventually finish it off. Also, this is the only intro in the series that doesn't really have a definitive ending to it. I guess you could say that it ends after the mom boss fight, but after that you still encounter the Scylla a few times, so maybe it's when you finally defeat it? I really don't know. Overall, aside from the narrative aspect, this intro just has a noticeable lack of tension compared to all the other ones. There really isn't any main set piece that holds it together. You kinda just go through it and then move on to the rest of the game without much sense of conclusiveness. So, while this intro is a step up in some ways compared to Chains of Olympus, there's definitely a little to be desired when you stack it up against the rest of the series. Number 6, God of War Ascension. While I definitely prefer Ghost of Sparta's intro to this one in terms of narrative, Ascension just kicks things off with way more of a bang. The beginning actually throws you straight into a flash forward late into the game's story, and while I don't think it was necessarily the best choice for the game's narrative, it definitely makes for a hype intro. You don't yet know why Kratos is tied up, but escaping while simultaneously landing a hit on the crazy bitch who's been torturing you sure feels great. After a few brief sections, we're then introduced to the aspect of this intro that absolutely carries it, the Hecatonkales. Having a creature so massive that it literally acts as both the environment and the boss is so cool, and makes for easily the best set piece in this video so far. Like, just look at this. This shit is so cinematic and engaging. The way it can transition from fighting the boss from one angle to then fighting in a completely different way because of how the arena shifted, and then suddenly you're going through a quick platforming section, it's just so energetic and awesome. There's also a few cool sections like fighting regular enemies in a building that continues rotating, or outrunning this spinny thing. And there are also some moments where things slow down and the game allows itself to show off different mechanics to the player. Now, in terms of flaws, I will admit that some phases of the main boss fight aren't the best, with easily the biggest offender being this part where you're somehow supposed to hit the sides of its mouth, meanwhile there's also a bunch of enemies keeping you busy. It's just way too overwhelming and honestly pretty bullshit. But overall, I still think this was a really memorable and hype way to kick off the game. Okay, so the intros I just covered were all pretty good. I like them. But now we're on to the mainline games of the series, and this is what inspired me to do this ranking. All of the mainline God of War games have peak intros. If this video was a tier list, then literally all of the top 5 spots would be an S tier. So with that being said, at number 5, I have the original God of War. Even after 18 years, this game's intro absolutely slaps. At the very start, we get one of the most iconic cutscenes in gaming, and after that, there isn't a second of wasted time. You immediately get thrown in to fight some enemies and get a handle on the game's combat, which is still a ton of fun after all this time. And then we get introduced to QuickTime events. Now, I know that QuickTime events are usually considered to be a negative aspect of games, since they can often feel intrusive or like they're replacing what could have been an awesome fight, and I don't deny that this can be the case. But in my opinion, the God of War games have the best QuickTime events I've ever seen. And the main reason for this is that they never try to be the main course. They always act as just a stylish way of finishing off an enemy or transitioning through a boss fight. They're never the focus of a battle. Instead, they just act as a fun way of adding some style to the game's encounters. Plus, 90% of the time, they're just really cool. I definitely think the encounters with the Hydra heads is the strongest aspect of this intro. They're good fun to fight, and their attacks are generally pretty fair and well made. But of course, the final encounter is definitely the best. Once again, coming back to the QuickTime events, they're just used really well here. Mashing O to pull on the Hydra's head and finish it off with the mast is so badass, and by the time I finished this boss fight, I knew I was gonna love this game. Aside from the boss, I think the setting of this intro is also really well done. There's almost always something going on in the background, giving you this feeling of being stuck in the middle of a big battle. The music is also awesome, and that applies to pretty much every spot from here on. And in terms of story, it was a really bold move from the developers to begin their game with the protagonist shrouded in mystery and then get his backstory later on.
I know who you are, Spartan. I know what you've done. I would rather die than be saved by you.
It's a cool way of making the player want to learn more about Kratos, and the final cutscene of the intro gives us pretty much everything we need to know for now. He's a warrior who serves the gods, and now he's been tasked with a mission to kill Ares. Honestly, I think this intro is just phenomenal. It does plenty to make it stand out compared to other action franchises in terms of gameplay, and gives us just the right amount of story setup before sailing to Athens. It does feel a little bad having it in the bottom half of the list, but the competition here really is that stiff. Number 4, God of War 2. While beginning a franchise with a banger opening is really important, I think it's even more satisfying when the second entry starts just as strong as the first. It's like the developer's way of saying, yeah, that first one wasn't just a one-hit wonder, we still got it. And this intro really delivers on exactly what you'd want after finishing the first game. We literally became the new God of War, and now's your chance to revel in it. Kratos is on Olympus doing whatever the hell he wants, and naturally he's still mad at the gods for not fulfilling their promise to him, so he's been doing a little trolling. And by trolling, I of course mean destroying cities. Also, can I just say that it feels really cool to actually see more gods in the flesh now. The only one we saw in person in the first game was Ares, and yeah. Back to God of War 2, I really have to commend this game for having a lot of impact narratively from the game's get-go. Zeus tricks Kratos by making him drain his godhood into the Blade of Olympus, and after giving him one last chance to prove his loyalty, which he refuses, obviously, He gets rid of him, leaving Zeus to assume that he no longer has to worry about being overthrown. Then, with a little help from Gaia, Kratos is back and ready for his quest to find the Sisters of Fate. And I just gotta mention the weirdly super clean looking CG cutscenes in this game. I'm sure that when it first came out, it was toe-to-toe with some of the best looking cutscenes in the medium. I don't know, I was just a stupid little kid at the time. But let's not forget the gameplay. This is easily one of the most action-packed intros I've ever had the pleasure of playing through. The boss fight against the Colossus is just so good. I love how many different ways this thing comes out of nowhere to surprise you with a new phase. This game is where the franchise really started to be insanely impressive in terms of scale, backed up by the thrilling QuickTime events as usual. And the setting of the giant battle in Rhodes complements it really well. Plus the music slaps. You get to use the new and improved Blades of Athena moveset, try out the Blade of Olympus, and you can even take a break and have a brief 100% family-friendly pool party. What's not to like? There's also a few small puzzles thrown in the mix to remind you that the game isn't 100% action all the time. I really can't think of any criticisms to give this opening sequence. The only thing holding it back is simply how great the top 3 are.
Do you see, gods of Olympus? Do you need more proof than this?
Number 3, God of War 2018. I already know that this is going to be my most controversial pick, since this intro debatably has the least hype out of any on the list. And I admit that compared to some previous entries, it doesn't serve as much as a perfectly exhilarating start, but at the same time, it isn't supposed to be. From a story perspective, this is one of the most effective ways I've ever seen a game start things off. The transition into the new style of the Norse games feels practically seamless, at least to me. And there are so many great small details, such as Kratos trying to hide his scars from the Blades of Chaos. It's very clear that he's still the capable Spartan demigod we've known up until now, but through time he's learned to mellow out, and he wants more than anything to learn from his past mistakes and bring up his son to be better than he was. Speaking of which, his relationship with Atreus feels completely organic. Naturally, Kratos isn't the world's kindest and most patient father, but he obviously means well. And I love how he's always the most disappointed with Atreus when he sees his old, rage-fueled self in him, as that's the main trait he would never want passed down to him. Also, Faye's funeral is exquisitely done, and the music is so beautifully slappin', it's enough to make a grown man cry.
Find your way home. You are free.
Plus, while I mostly praise this intro for the story and emotions, it's not like it's completely devoid of hype. While the troll boss fight is definitely reused way too many times throughout the game, I still like the initial encounter with it, since it actually is a fun and well-designed boss. But it's got nothing on the Baldur fight. After a mostly slow and melancholy beginning to the game, this asshole showing up on Kratos' front doorstep is a very quick and effective change of pace. And not only is it just a really fun and fair fight, but it's such an entertaining ride. The fact that Baldur is invincible gave the devs an excuse to think of so many different ways for Kratos to beat the absolute shit out of him, only for him to always come back seconds later. All the while, he keeps egging you on, trying to see if the infamous ghost of Sparta can somehow break the curse and actually get him to feel something. Plus, that moment where he forces you to use Spartan Rage for the first time is so hype. And while this fight doesn't have the same awe-inducing scale as in some of the other games, the fact that you're both constantly destroying the environment around you feels really satisfying and like your attacks carry a lot of weight. Still, I could see some people making the argument that this intro should be lower, but for me, I think there's just too much to love about it, along with also having a bit of the peak action that these intros are known for. Number 2, God of War Ragnarok. Now, keep in mind, these last 2 spots were incredibly difficult to decide on. I've gone back and forth with them over and over again, but ultimately, I decided that Ragnarok gets second place for me. That said, this intro is basically perfect. It has the more emotional moments like 2018's intro, while also being a shit ton of fun in terms of gameplay. First, we get a brief scene establishing that Kratos and Atreus' bond has grown stronger since the previous game. Then, only a few minutes in, we're ambushed by Freya, which gives us a bit of a return to form with some QuickTime events, since 2018 was definitely the game with the least QuickTime events in the franchise. After that, we get a sad moment where Atreus says goodbye to Fenrir, we get to see Kratos having a conversation with Faye in his dreams. Then we go out to look for Atreus with Mimir, where we get a handle on some of the minor tweaks made to the combat. Following this, we get a fun and effective tutorial boss with a bear, which turns out to be Atreus, giving us a cool new revelation about his abilities. Overall, everything up to this point of the intro is handled with such delicacy. The hopelessness and uncertainty that comes from being in the middle of Fimbulwinter and not knowing what the future holds just makes everyone feel a little on edge. Atreus claims that he feels like they should be doing more to figure out what fate has in store for them. Meanwhile, Kratos, trying to be a responsible father and not repeat the mistakes of his past, doesn't want to do anything that would lead to confrontation with others. I also think Mimir is used pretty damn well here. He gives lots of insightful nods and just straight up great conversations with Kratos.
A reckoning will come. That is why Atreus must learn to survive on his own.
Oh, this is about that prophecy. Just because the giants had you dead on some wall full of otherwise accurate predictions.
I do not believe in prophecies.
Well, good.
Then after some more fights with some regular enemies alongside Atreus, we go back home for some rest. And just like 2018, the intro is suddenly turned on its head when we get a visitor. Afterward, we get a super tense and well-written conversation between Kratos, Thor, and Odin. And to summarize it, Odin claims that he just wants peace, and even offers a pretty sweet deal for Kratos in return for no quarrel. Then Kratos rejects it with one of the best meme templates ever conceived, and of course, we get the fight against Thor, which, in my opinion, is the best boss fight in any of these intros. Not only is the gameplay and the spectacle absolutely top-notch, but the dialogue is just the cherry on top. The entire time, Thor continuously tries to get under your skin, saying that Kratos doesn't live up to the crazy feats he was known for doing in the past. And every time you get a good hit on him, it's just the most satisfying shit ever.
You know my past? The ghost of Sparta thing? Yeah. Then you know what I'm capable of. Show me!
As it goes on, we get more super hype phase transitions and another peak meme template, leading into the final phase where the fight gets even more tense and fun. And then it all culminates in the best moment in any of these intros.
Now, I see why my sons fell to you. Even this lesser version of you. But I am not my sons. And your boy, Allfather, have plans for him.
So I think God of War Ragnarok has a near perfect intro. It's the most well-rounded one on the list, coming with lots of appropriate build-up for the narrative, unforgettable moments and dialogue, along with some of the best gameplay you'll find in the opening hour of a game. If I were to try and rank these intros objectively, then Ragnarok would probably be number one. But sometimes, it's just impossible to compete with pure hype. Number 1, God of War 3. It's almost hard to put into words just how phenomenal the opening sequence of this game is. But to fully dissect it, we obviously have to start by mentioning the cliffhanger ending of God of War 2.
Zeus, your son has returned! I bring the destruction of Olympus!
Now, this was a pretty wild cliffhanger when it came out. The hype of Kratos bringing the Titans back from the past and climbing Mount Olympus to finally destroy Zeus would not be something the developers could easily live up to with God of War 3. Yet they somehow managed to not only live up to the hype, but, in my opinion, surpass it. How the hell was that even possible? And before we even get to the actual game, I have to mention the opening credits that play when you launch it. This shit is so cool. The gorgeous visuals accompanied by the peak soundtrack as it recaps the events of the first two games is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. I still watch the whole thing like every other time I launch this game. It's just too good. And after starting a new save, we then get one of my favorite cutscenes in gaming, where the camera takes us on a journey from the depths of hell all the way to the peak of Mount Olympus as Zeus gives a speech to his fellow gods. Meanwhile, the Titans are slowly climbing their way to the top, and the presentation is just remarkable. In fact, that's kind of the best thing about this intro as a whole, the unforgettable presentation of everything. For example, while I do love the Norse God of War games, one of my biggest issues with them is how 90% of the time the camera just stays in the same over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, which isn't necessarily bad, but it just doesn't have the same diversity as it does in the Greek games. Even just during gameplay, the camera is so dynamic, and it does an insanely good job at selling you on the sense of scale present in this intro. Like when Kratos is shimmying alongside the mountain, and then suddenly the camera points upward as we see Gaia get pulled down by one of Poseidon's hippocampi. Or just the super energetic way it follows you in each of the peak QuickTime events. And at this point, I think it's impossible to go on without mentioning the Poseidon boss fight.
You challenge me, mortal? God of Olympus?
Without a doubt, one of my favorite spectacle bosses I've ever fought. The way you fight off all of the hippocampi is unforgettable. Since you spend most of the fight riding on Gaia, it creates so many dynamic situations, like at one point her arm falls back and you're hanging upside down from it, meanwhile you're still fighting. And then she grabs back onto the mountainside and the camera flies through the trees on her arm to then reveal you still hanging off the side where you have to keep fighting. And all of the QuickTime event finishers throughout the fight are just so cool. Then we get to the final stretch against the man himself. After Gaia pins him to the wall, you get a brief, decently designed fight with him. And after protecting Gaia one last time, we get to ride her hand as she punches him and Kratos flies out, dragging Poseidon's true body out of the water. Following this, we then get one of the most iconic QuickTime events in gaming, where the camera switches to a first-person perspective of Poseidon as we watch ourselves beat the shit out of him. It's a pretty epic conclusion to a super fun and fair boss fight. There's also just a ton of small details throughout this intro that adds so much to it. There are so many things going on in the background, like witnessing the Titans just take L after L. But I honestly like that your allies take so much damage, because it makes Kratos feel really important, despite being so physically small in the grandiosity of what's going on. And of course, the music is just so awesome and adds a lot to make the scenes feel more epic. If I were to have one nitpick, there are a few slow sections here and there that hurt the pacing of the intro just a little bit. But I guess I have to remember that for anyone who's playing this as their first God of War game, it also has to act like a tutorial to an extent, so I can easily give this a pass. But when looking at this intro as a whole, I really think it is just a perfect experience. Like I said, I think Ragnarok's intro is definitely more well-rounded, and the Thor fight just has to earn the gold medal for the best opening boss. But for me, God of War 3 just gets the edge for following up on God of War 2's conclusion so perfectly and providing some of the best spectacle that this series has to offer. But now that I've shown you my list, please feel free to let me know your ranking in the comments. As many of you can probably tell, I've been going through a bit of a God of War phase lately. I played through all these games for the first time within this last year, and I just couldn't resist the idea of making a video on it since I was really surprised at just how much I enjoyed my time with these games. I don't know for sure what my next video will be, but I'll try to cook up something worthwhile. Possibly something Sekiro related, but we'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching. See ya.